Welcome back to the deep dive. We're cracking open a true classic today, excerpts from Edward Gibbon's monumental The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 2.
Yeah, and this is it's more than just dry history, isn't it? It's Gibbon's unique, often quite challenging perspective on a really pivotal era.
Absolutely. Our mission in this deep dive is, well, to explore Gibbon's account of the 4th century Roman Empire. Such a time of radical change.
Right. You've got shifts in power, the dramatic rise of Christianity.
And these external pressures starting to reshape everything.
Right.
And just to be clear, everything we discussed today comes straight from the material you've shared with us.
And Gibbon, well, he doesn't pull punches, does he? Or stick to simple stories. We'll get into his surprising take on early Christian persecution.
The vision, maybe divine, maybe not, for a new capital city.
The really complex figure of an emperor tagged as the apostate.
And then the sudden, frankly terrifying arrival of new barbarian forces on the scene.
Yeah, it's quite a century.
Okay, let's dive right in. The early Roman view of Christians. Gibbon paints them as this strange and abhorred society.
Hmm. And those rumors he mentions?
Oh, the rumors? He says people pretended to confess or relate these bizarre rites, things about infants, blood, secret wounds, even incestuous commerce, just wild stuff.
But what's key is how Gibbon presents them. These aren't facts about Christians he's confirming. They're the accusations, the rumors flying around.
Right. It tells you about the atmosphere, the fear and suspicion.
Exactly, that public perception.
And this suspicion, it really boiled over with Nero, didn't it, after the Great Fire of Rome?
Yeah, the source describes massive devastation. Nero tried to help people open gardens, built temporary housing, got provisions.
But the rumor was he started it. People suspected him.
And Tacitus, who Gibbon quotes, says Nero needed a scapegoat to divert suspicion.
And to the Christians, already seen by many Romans as branded with deserved infamy.
Right. And Tacitus makes that crucial point. They were convicted not so much for the crime of setting fire to the city as for their hatred of humankind.
Their perceived separateness, their alienation, was the real problem for the Romans.
Precisely.
And the punishments were just horrific. Crucifixion, being torn apart by dogs, used as human torches.
Terrible things. But then Gibbon pulls back a bit. He tries to give a broader context to Roman policy overall.
He makes that really striking comparison, doesn't he? Saying Roman emperors weren't necessarily worse than, say, Charles V or Louis IV in the religious wars.
Yeah, he argues their conduct was by no means so criminal, which is quite a claim.
Why does he argue that? What's the reasoning?
Well, he says the Romans were essentially strangers to the whole Christian idea of, the rights of conscience.
Okay.
They saw Christianity's refusal to join in public rites, what they called its inflexible obstinacy, as rejecting the state itself. It was a refusal of legal and, as it were, a natural submission to the sacred institutions of their country.
Ah. So less about heresy, more about civic duty. Patriotism, even.
That's the core of Gibbon's argument here. It was viewed through a lens of state stability, not just theological disagreement.
Interesting.
And he thinks this perspective might have actually sometimes abated the vigor of the persecutions.
How so?
Because magistrates often acted out of temperate policy, maybe even contempt, rather than furious zeal. Sometimes just dismissing them was easier than full-blown religious war.
Which leads him to some, well, pretty controversial conclusions about how widespread the early persecution actually was.
Yeah, he suggests it took a considerable time for Christians to even become a major government concern.
And that convictions were often handled with caution and reluctance, punishments sometimes moderate.
And importantly, that the church had many intervals of peace and tranquility. It wasn't constant, unrelenting terror everywhere all the time, according to his reading.
He gives examples like the grandsons of St. Jude.
Right. They get brought before a magistrate, they show their calloused farmer hands, say their kingdom is spiritual, not of this world.
And they get dismissed, basically seen as harmless peasants. Compassion and contempt, Gibbon calls it.
Yeah. And then perhaps the most challenging point for later tradition.
The number of martyrs.
Exactly. He quotes early figures like Origen and Dionysius, who apparently stated the number was very inconsiderable.
Origen used express terms, Gibbon says. And Dionysius, during a specific persecution in Alexandria, counted only 10 men and 7 women executed.
It directly contradicts those later stories of a formidable army of martyrs. Gibbon clearly suspects some later exaggeration for, effect or veneration.
The story of Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, really illustrates this idea that maybe the danger for bishops wasn't always as extreme as we might think.
Right. Cyprian actually went into hiding during one persecution to preserve himself and his leadership, which, Gibbon notes, drew criticism from the more rigid Christians at the time.
But later, when he is put on trial,
Under proconsul Paternus, yeah. He declares who he is, uses his rights as a citizen.
and the sentence isn't immediate death, it's banishment. To Curubis, which Gibbon calls a pleasant situation with conveniences of life.
Hardly a horrific dungeon, is it?
Not really. He's recalled later, and then a new proconsul comes with orders to execute Christian leaders. Cyprian knows his time is up.
But even then, the process seems quite orderly. He's taken to a private house, has dinner, sees friends.
Then the trial. He refuses to sacrifice. The sentence is beheading.
Which Gibbon points out was the mildest and least painful form of capital punishment in Rome.
And the execution itself, the Christian crowd cries out, "We will die with him," but it proceeds. Deacons are there. Linen is spread for his blood. Cyprian even pays the executioner.
Yeah, 25 pieces of gold. And his body isn't desecrated. It's taken away in a triumphal procession for burial. No interference.
And he was the first bishop in Africa considered a martyr.
First, that detail matters to Gibbon's argument about scale.
He suggests the desire for martyrdom was strong, eternal bliss, reputation on earth, and those who confessed but weren't killed were still highly honored.
Right, kissing their chains, their wounds. Gibbon uses all this to argue that the actual number who died was likely smaller than later accounts imply.
And this leads him back to that comparison, pagan persecution of Christians versus later Christian persecution of other Christians, like in the Netherlands under Charles V.
Yeah, he implies the latter might have been far bloodier, questioning the reliability of later Christian historians writing about persecutions under defeated enemies. He's urging critical reading of sources.
So the big takeaway from Gibbon on this: early Christians suffered, definitely, but maybe the scale wasn't as vast, and the Roman motives were more political fear of civic disruption than purely religious hatred compared to later narratives.
Precisely. It's a nuanced, maybe uncomfortable, but fascinating perspective based on his reading of the sources available to him.
Okay, moving from that challenging existence,
Yeah.
a massive shift happens with Constantine.
Oh, Constantine. He's absolutely central. Gibbon says he removed the seat of empire, brought in a new capital, a new policy, and a new religion.
And these weren't just temporary changes. They were embraced by succeeding generations.
Huge impact.
His conversion is obviously key for the religious shift, the Edict of Milan.
Which granted free exercise of their religious ceremonies to all. A landmark moment.
Gibbon suggests Constantine was influenced partly by his father, who was lenient towards Christians, but also maybe by his own secret and sincere reverence for the name of Christ.
The stories of how he converted vary, though. Lactantius talks about a dream before a battle, telling him to put Christ's monogram on the shields.
Eusebius mentions seeing a luminous cross in the sky. By this conquer. And then a dream appearance by Christ.
Yeah, dramatic accounts. Gibbon presents them, but then he steps back to analyze.
He acknowledges that we, as modern readers, might suspect it was all just cynical politics, willful falsehood, deliberate perjury, using the church as a footstool to the throne.
He puts that cynical view out there, but then he adds nuance.
Right. He says, look, it was an age of intense religious feeling. Even a statesman might catch some enthusiasm.
And self-interest can genuinely shape belief, can it? Plus the vanity of being chosen by heaven.
And maybe an initial specious piety, sort of faking it, could actually become serious faith over time.
He also notes Constantine studied scripture, wrote discourses, debated bishops. One bishop apparently had huge influence, which pagans called magic.
So it's complicated, not necessarily pure faith, not necessarily pure politics, maybe a mix.
That seems to be Gibbon's implication, a complex figure with complex motives.
And the church itself adapted pretty quickly to having an emperor on side.
Oh, yeah. Gibbon notes a relaxation of some strict earlier rules. Constantine prayed with them, preached, even called himself a priest and hierophant before he was even baptized.
Which he famously delayed until his deathbed.
Right, and Gibbon is quite critical of that, saying it set a bad example, encouraging later rulers to think they could sin now and wash it all away later.
So Constantine actively promoted Christianity, removed disadvantages, gave free permission, a liberal encouragement to its ministers.
And Gibbon suggests the motives for people converting en masse were, well, mixed. Hopes of wealth and honors, the emperor's example, his irresistible smiles influencing the crowds.
Cities that destroyed pagan temples got perks, like municipal privileges.
And Constantinople, the new capital, was unique, built from the start without any official pagan worship. Never profaned by the worship of idols, as Gibbon puts it.
The church also gained enormous wealth, recovered property lost in persecutions.
Got state support, but mostly relied on voluntary oblations. And crucially, Constantine allowed people to leave their fortunes to the church in their wills.
That must have made a huge difference.
Massive. Plus Constantine's own generosity. Gibbon mentions him sending a huge sum, like 18,000 pounds sterling in Gibbon's time, to churches in Africa.
And Gibbon adds that little barb, his liberality, quote, increased in a just proportion to his faith and to his vices.
Hey, typical Gibbon. Constantine also gave grain allowances and favored those joining monastic life.
So in just one reign, the church goes from a sometimes persecuted, often poor minority
to a powerful, wealthy institution deeply connected to the state, a complete reversal.
This era also sees the founding of Constantinople, not just moving the capital, but building a new Rome.
Exactly. Constantine wanted a permanent base, somewhere strategic. The confines of Europe and Asia made sense facing barbarians on the Danube and the Persians in the east.
He chose Byzantium specifically for its incomparable position, and of course to name it after himself.
That location was brilliant. The Bosphorus Strait controlling access, great for trade, easy to defend, famously better than Chalcedon across the water.
Gibbon lists the advantages: central location, secure harbor, defensible land approach, good climate, fertile land nearby, trade routes converging.
It had everything, a natural hub.
Constantine apparently liked to frame the choice as divinely inspired. That story of him tracing the walls with the lance.
And saying he'd keep going till he, the invisible guide who marches before me, thinks proper to stop. Adds a bit of mystique, doesn't it?
It does. And the scale was immense. 7 hills, thousands of acres. Cost a fortune. Gibbon estimates 2.5 million pounds just for walls, porticos, aqueducts.
Finding skilled architects was tough, apparently. They had to set up schools.
And getting people to move there. He basically had to bribe or compel the elite, offering palaces, land, pensions. Invitations were like commands.
Right. An artificial colony, Gibbon calls it, built at the expense of older cities.
It was built incredibly fast, though maybe some corners were cut hasty and imperfect buildings.
And they stripped art and statues from all over Greece and Asia to decorate it. Trophies, statues of gods, heroes, philosophers.
Gibbon quotes someone saying only the souls are missing.
Ouch. Captures the scale of the appropriation, though.
The dedication had games, giveaways, and that odd tradition of the emperor adoring a statue of Constantine in the Hippodrome each year.
It was officially Second or New Rome, but everyone called it Constantinople. The name stuck.
And this new capital came with a new, or maybe refined, administration, building on Diocletian's system.
Yeah, Diocletian's reforms were the foundation. Constantine tweaked and expanded it.
The old consuls, for example, became mostly ceremonial. Appointed by the emperor, their names just marked the year.
The patrician rank also changed, no longer hereditary, but a personal honor given by the emperor to favorites.
A big change was the power of the Praetorian prefects. They went from city officials to essentially super governors.
Right. Huge civil and criminal jurisdiction, overseeing provinces, justice, finance, and a massive bureaucracy for everything from police and food supply to sewers and markets.
Provincial governors reported to them. Gibbon mentions a couple of rules meant to curb abuse.
Like governors not being able to impose heavy fines or exile on the wealthy that was reserved for the prefects, and rules against governing your home province or owning local land, trying to limit corruption, I suppose.
But here's where Gibbon points to some emerging weaknesses, especially in the military. Constantine split the army.
Yes. You had the Palatines, the court troops in the cities, and the borderers, the Limitanei on the frontiers.
The Palatines got better pay and perks, but Gibbon says they became soft, enervated by luxury, lost their fighting spirit, even became afraid of the barbarians.
While the borderers with lower pay were stuck on the frontiers, their morale degraded, and the actual legions were made smaller and broken up into more units.
I'll do that.
To prevent rebellion. Smaller units, scattered command, less chance of a powerful general marching on the emperor. It secured the tranquility of the monarch, as Gibbon puts it.
But relaxed the vigor of the state. It weakened the overall defense.
Exactly. A trade-off that would prove costly.
We also see this incredibly complex court bureaucracy taking shape. Masters of offices, quaestors, counts of sacred largesses, managing everything from posts and arsenals to laws and finance.
Including state-run textile mills staffed by women.
Gibbon notes torture was mainly for servile bodies, not citizens without strong evidence.
But he makes a broader point for the average person, the obscure millions. The bigger daily threat wasn't necessarily cruelty, but avarice and excessive taxes.
He points to Campania becoming desolate just decades after Constantine, blaming Roman administration and taxes before the major barbarian invasions really hit hard there.
So Constantine's legacy is huge, transformative, but also contains the seeds of future problems. The military changes, the tax burden, these created vulnerabilities.
And those vulnerabilities were tested almost immediately after he died. Strife among his successors, new threats.
Yep. Empire divided among his 3 sons, and his ministers and generals wasted no time murdering his nephews to consolidate power for the sons. Grim start.
The sons fought each other, too. Eventually, Constantius was the last one standing.
His reign was tough. The long war with Persia under Sapors II, Gibbon mentions Constantius having the effeminate troops of Asia to fight him.
And internal problems kept popping up,
Mm-hmm.
like the usurpation by Magnentius in Gaul.
That led to a major civil war. Battles in Pannonia. Constantius was cautious, Magnentius aggressive. Magnentius even refused a peace deal that would have given him the West.
Constantius also had that difficult situation with his cousin Gallus, whom he made Caesar in the east.
Right. Put him under surveillance, weak and cruel administration. Gallus eventually had Constantius's ministers killed in Antioch.
Which basically sealed Gallus's fate. Showed he couldn't handle power responsibly.
Gibbon paints Constantius himself as composed of pride and weakness, of superstition and cruelty. Lacked his father's spark. He died relatively young, maybe naming Julian's successor. The army chose Julian anyway.
Which brings us to Julian, the apostate.
That name says so much about how history, especially Christian history, viewed him. Pagans saw him differently, a philosopher king. Gibbon tries to use contemporary sources, including Julian's own writings, to get a more balanced picture.
His ruling passion, Gibbon says, was devotion to the old pagan gods. So strong it warped his enlightened understanding with superstitious prejudice.
And this made his conflict with Christians an irreconcilable hostility.
Though when he first took power, he issued an edict of toleration, right?
He did. Free and equal toleration. Surprised everyone. But Ammianus, the historian living then, saw it as affected clemency, an insidious design to weaken Christianity by letting all the different Christian factions fight each other.
Clever, in a way. He recalled exiled bishops from opposing groups, Arians, Nicenes, Donatists, and apparently enjoyed watching them argue at the palace. Found them worse enemies to each other than the Franks or Alemanni.
He actively tried to restore paganism, took the title Supreme Pontiff, set up chapels, sacrificed daily, personally getting involved, handling the knife, reading entrails.
Gibbon notes even some pagans thought this was excessive, this extravagant superstition. The sheer cost of sacrifices was huge jokes about running out of cattle.
But here's the really interesting part. According to Gibbon, Julian tried to reform paganism using Christianity as a model. He issued instructions for pagan priests, emphasizing morality, chastity, study, avoiding taverns, teaching about good gods and an afterlife, things that sounded, well, quite Christian in their focus on ethics.
And crucially, Gibbon says, Julian pushed for benevolence and hospitality. He wanted pagan priests to practice charity.
Yes, he promised state funds for the poor and planned to set up hospitals in every city, open to everyone, without any invidious distinction of country or of religion.
Wow. He was directly copying the church's social structures.
Gibbon says Julian beheld with envy the wise and humane regulations of the church and wanted to steal their thunder, basically, deprive Christians of the credit they got from their charity.
That's fascinating, recognizing the social power of Christianity.
Another big move, trying to rebuild the Jewish temple in Jerusalem.
Why?
Gibbon argues it was strategic. Christians believed its destruction fulfilled prophecy, proving Jesus was the Messiah. Rebuilding it would undermine that claim. A specious argument against the faith of prophecy.
Julian praised the Jews, offered protection. As a polytheist, he could respect their local and national deity within his own system.
But alongside all this, he practiced what Gibbon calls artful persecution. Formal freedom of worship, yes, but constant undermining and contempt.
He encouraged calling Christians Galileans, fanatics, hinted violence might be needed.
And took concrete steps. Shifted funds from the church to pagan temples, stripped clergy of privileges, restricted donations, made them pay for pagan temples they'd destroyed earlier.
So not outright violence like Nero, but a systematic attempt to weaken and delegitimize the church.
Exactly. When Christians reacted zealously, maybe destroying an altar, Julian ensured they faced the law. They saw it as martyrdom, he saw it as justice for the gods. It just deepened the hostility.
His time in Antioch shows his character too. Admired the scholar Libanius, but mishandled the famine.
By fixing grain prices too low, causing hoarding, he got obstinate when people complained, reminding Gibbon of his less pleasant relative, Gallus. It strained relations.
This maybe pushed him towards seeking glory in the Persian War, a more splendid and memorable achievement. He rejected Sapor's peace offers
The campaign itself was dramatic. He got tricked by a Persian defector.
and made that hugely controversial decision to burn his fleet and most of his supplies on the Tigris. Christian writers called it madness.
Yeah, left the army in a precarious spot. But Julian himself showed bravery in battles, discipline,
There's that story of him addressing troops complaining about pay.
reminding them the real riches were with the enemy, declaring his own honorable poverty, appealing to their virtue. And it worked. They rallied.
But the campaign ultimately stalled. They reached Ctesiphon but didn't besiege it, started retreating.
And during a battle on the retreat, Julian was wounded. A dart. Died a few hours later.
Gibbon mentions the Roman funeral tradition satire mixed with praise, comedians mocking Julian's superstition, his vanity, with Christians in the audience applauding.
A stark image. Gibbon's final assessment. Julian had flaws, lacked the specific greatness of a Caesar or an Augustus. But he handled adversity and success well, tried to link power with merit.
And Gibbon concludes that even his enemies admitted his genius, his love for Rome, that the apostate Julian deserved the empire of the world. High praise, despite the criticism.
A complex, tragic figure in Gibbon's telling. His failure showed just how entrenched Christianity had become.
So after Julian, the empire is unstable. Jovian takes over briefly, and then the external threats really ramp up.
Right. Gibbon sets the scene with a huge earthquake and tsunami, a natural disaster, but he uses it to pivot. The real danger, he says, isn't nature, it's the passions of his fellow creatures.
And he links this to the reign of Valens, dating the start of the fall, really, to his time and the arrival of the pastoral nations, Scythians, Tartars.
He describes their nomadic lifestyle vividly, constantly moving, living off herds, always ready for war. Camps are their cities.
Their social structure, the Khan, the council, could forge powerful empires quickly under a strong leader.
And he focuses on the Huns, their origins near China, their incredible cavalry skills, how they terrified the Chinese.
The Great Wall, tribute, even sending princesses. China tried everything.
When the Huns were later defeated by others, they migrated west. Some settled down, became the White Huns. Others kept moving, getting fiercer.
They clashed with groups like the Alani.
Yeah, described as different-looking, martial, worshipping a sword. The Huns beat them.
The Alani scattered, some to the Caucasus, some joined other groups raiding Europe, but many ended up absorbed by the Huns.
This whole westward push by the Huns then hits the Goths,
Who flee in terror and ask the Romans for permission to cross the Danube and settle inside the empire.
a fateful moment. But the Roman officials on the border, like Lupicinus, were corrupt. They exploited the Goths terribly,
Denied them food, mistreated them.
which led directly to the Gothic War. Fritigern led the Goths in revolt, won a major victory against Lupicinus near Marcianopolis.
Gibbon calls that day the end of Roman security. The Goths went from refugees to rebels taking revenge.
Other Goths, already inside the empire, joined them. The situation spiraled.
Emperor Valens, way over in Antioch, reacted slowly. Eventually marched west, asked his nephew Gratian for help.
But leading up to the big battle, Valens made a fatal mistake.
Adrianople.
Yes. He was flattered into thinking he could win alone, ignored Gratian's advice to wait for reinforcements. Fritigern played him, pretending to want peace while luring him into battle.
Valens' unseizable bravery, Gibbon calls it, led to a catastrophic defeat. Valens was killed.
A disaster for Rome. Gibbon quotes St. Jerome's lament about the devastation the Goths caused afterwards: massacres, fires, churches defiled.
Though Gibbon, characteristically, pushes back against the hyperbole, questioning claims that nothing was left, not even wildlife. Nature finds a way, he implies.
Always the critical historian.
So after the disaster of Adrianople and Valens' death, the job of stabilizing the East falls to Theodosius.
Right. Theodosius comes from a respected Spanish military family. His father was a famous general.
Theodosius himself had served with distinction, was popular with troops, but faced court envy. His father was actually executed, forcing Theodosius into retirement in Spain.
Living the quiet life on his estate. Gibbon emphasizes his firm and temperate character during this time.
Then, suddenly, plucked from this obscure solitude at age 33 to become emperor.
A pure and so honorable elevation, Gibbon says. Gratian recognized his virtue and ability despite what happened to his father. Desperate times called for proven talent.
Expectations were huge, and his approach was totally different from Valens.
Completely. No rash charges. He acted like a firm and faithful guardian, set up HQ in Thessalonica, strengthened defenses, restored discipline.
His strategy was patient. Small, calculated attacks, frequent sallies only when he had the advantage. Slowly rebuilt army confidence. The well-concerted plan.
Gibbon compares him to Fabius Maximus, the cunctator, the delayer who saved Rome centuries earlier. Theodosius's skill wasn't flashy battlefield glory, but strategy, logistics, discipline.
Earning solid and independent fame, he stayed focused even when ill.
Choosing patience and containment over immediate risky confrontation. A crucial difference that helped manage the Gothic crisis, at least for a while.
Definitely a lesson there.
Absolutely. Leadership in crisis.
So we've covered a huge sweep of the 4th century through Gibbon's lens in this deep dive.
Yeah, from the early Christian experience, Gibbon's rather revisionist take on persecution.
Through the monumental changes under Constantine. The new capital, church and state getting intertwined, the admin and military reforms. Some with those unintended consequences.
Then Julian's really fascinating counter-revolution, trying to revive paganism, even copying Christian charity structures.
And his ultimately failed campaign against both Persia and the tide of history, really.
And finally, the arrival of the Huns, the Gothic disaster under Valens, and Theodosius stepping in with that more measured, strategic approach.
It's just an era packed with transformation, conflict, and big personalities shaping the empire's path.
Absolutely. Internal changes meeting these immense external pressures.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Considering Constantine's possible mix of faith and policy, Julian trying to replicate Christian social success for paganism, Theodosius finding strength in patience, not just force.
What does this whole period, especially as Gibbon presents it, tell us about that relationship between belief, raw power, and just practical governance? How do they shape empires and maybe even, human history itself?
It's definitely not simple. There are no easy answers in Gibbon.
No, that's kind of the point. I think it challenges you.
Something to keep pondering. Well, that's our deep dive for today. We hope you feel a bit more immersed in this incredibly pivotal and often dramatic century of Roman history.